Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, foreign policy, and international relations. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. In today's episode, Wesley Wark, Artur Wilczynski, and Philippe Lagassé discuss the Global Security Reporting Program amid recent allegations made by Michael Spavor and concerns raised by individuals about the transparency and accountability of the program. The panel will discuss allegations against the GSRP, the evolution of GSRP in the context of emerging global threats, the difference between foreign intelligence collection and diplomatic reporting, strengthening cooperation between GSRP, CSIS, and the Foreign Ministry, as well as the implications for placing the program on a statutory footing and the desired role for GSRP. This is the Expert Series. Michael Spavor, one of the Canadians detained in China for nearly 3 years, is seeking a multi-million-dollar settlement, claiming that his fellow detainee, Michael Kovrig, inadvertently provided intelligence on North Korea to Canadian and allied spy services through his work in Canada's Global Security Reporting Program. Spavor alleges that Kovrig's actions within the GSRP led to their arrest by Chinese authorities in 2018. Up first to discuss the mandate of GSRP, transparency, accountability, diplomatic reporting, and intelligence cooperation, we have Artur Wilczynski, former Director General for Intelligence Operations for CSE, and former Deputy Chief for Signals Intelligence. Artur, it's great to have you back on the program. Thanks for joining me. Maybe you could begin by explaining what specific types of security-related information the GSRP aims to collect and how this information is utilized by the Canadian government.
The Global Security Reporting Program was created in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. And it really was in response to what proved to be a challenging environment where resources became increasingly scarce to provide focused reporting on a wide range of issues related to security. And so what was decided is that we needed a cohort of diplomats who were posted in key places around the world that would be able to engage, as all diplomats do, with a range of embassy contacts and speak about a range of issues that were particular to the country in which they were accredited to, that would inform a broader ecosystem, specifically looking at questions of national security, crime, counterterrorism, defense, a broad range of issues. And the way that they did that is, quite frankly, like typical diplomatic reporting, right? It's just that they would meet with embassy contacts, they'd introduce themselves, say, "Hi, I'm from the Embassy of Canada. I'd like to chat with you about your expertise and about your insight." So there was no kind of cover, there was no obfuscation, there was no doubt that who local contacts were meeting with were employees of the embassies of Canada in various countries around the world. Now, what they reported on was very much aligned with the specificity of the country that they were accredited to. So GSRP officers didn't have, here's your 3 things in all the countries that you're accredited to, thou shalt report on this. I mean, there's a level of discretion that's given to diplomats who understand the broad range of issues that are of interest in their fields of expertise. And they were provided guidance, they were provided training in terms of how and to make sure that there is a level of safety and security associated with what they do. But like other diplomatic reporting, it was basically you sit down with a contact, you talk to them about a bunch of stuff that you think is interesting and relevant, that the contact thinks is interesting and relevant, or that the contact has an intent to provide you. And then you write a diplomatic cable like diplomats have been doing since the practice has been created. In terms of how is it used by the government of Canada, I think that people have a bit of an instrumental approach to how diplomatic or other kind of reporting is used by government officials. So in my career, in my relationship with information and intelligence has primarily been as a consumer. And what I think people misunderstand is that every piece of information, every piece of intel as provided by intelligence collectors is specifically used for a particular outcome. And while that happens sometimes, the vast majority of reporting, whether it's diplomatic or intelligence or whatever, media, it's part of an information ecosystem that policymakers have that provide them a broad range of information that enable them to make decisions that are fed by and informed by as broad a range of sources as possible. One of the biggest challenges, whether it's in foreign policy, whether it's in national security, whether it's in defense or anything, is that you have a blind spot. And what you need is to have a wide series of sources of information that can then inform your perspective, so that when you are making decisions about whatever policy is in front of you, that they're grounded in as broad an information ecosystem as possible. So the GSRP reporting was just one of the tools in that information ecosystem that allowed a wide range of Canadian, but also Five Eyes and allied and partner governments, have access to unique types of information that they would then make decisions in the national interest.
How can the concerns regarding diplomats potentially exceeding their authority within the global security reporting program be effectively addressed? And what measures could enhance transparency and accountability in the program's activities?
I think that's a really important and a completely legitimate question, right? Folks, GSRP, diplomats, any public official, we're human beings, we make mistakes. Sometimes, we don't exercise the best judgment, and that needs to be addressed. And the way it's addressed is by both effective oversight, and what we mean by oversight are senior managers, whether or not it's the direct manager of a diplomat at an embassy, including the ambassador or the head of mission, whether or not it's folks in the chain of authority back at headquarters, such as directors general, ADMs, right up to ministers, to understand what folks are doing, to have effective conversations, not only with your team about what is an appropriate risk to take, what is an appropriate methodology to use when you're speaking with folks. And then if you hear about folks not behaving in a way that they're supposed to, that there needs to be an appropriate accountability in terms of the officer, that you sit down, you address the challenge, you make sure that they understand the parameters of their work. And if they are not a good fit, then remove them from that specific responsibility, because the reality is there are risks associated with diplomacy. When you go into very complex and at sometimes dangerous parts of the world, and you're associated with an embassy, you have to recognize that there are risks, and as a governmental entity, we have a duty of care to make sure that folks behave in a way that's appropriate. We have international obligations. The 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Affairs is very precise in terms of what diplomats can do, and it is our job to ensure that everyone who is out there working within diplomacy remains consistent with those various principles. Again, duty of care, appropriate training, accountability, oversight. And again, adhesion to the rule of law and compliance with the rule of law. So it's that basket of things that at the front end, I think is appropriate. The second part is review, and I think that is fundamentally important. And it's one of the things that wasn't in place when I was the Director General responsible for the program. So I'm actually a big fan of review and of organizations such as the National Security Intelligence and Review Agency and the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, because they can go look at a wide range of activities that are done in the national security kind of sphere. They have authorization to look at all government departments and agencies who work in this ecosystem, and actually look at and see whether or not the kind of risk management framework is appropriate, to see whether or not the objectives are clearly articulated, and then make recommendations if they think that there is an inappropriate level of risk, or if there's an ineffectiveness to the program, to make sure that, again, that when we spend public dollars, that we're doing it in a way that actually meets Canadians' needs and expectations. People need to understand the difference between foreign intelligence collection and diplomatic reporting. Foreign intelligence is actually a term of art. And when people use that in a cavalier way or in an inappropriate way to describe what is legitimate diplomatic activity, I think that it puts those of us who have worked in diplomacy in harm's way. And I think it's profoundly irresponsible. And I think that people need to understand why that kind of inference that is drawn by hostile states when folks who used to work in intelligence imply it is very, very troubling to me. And I think they need to be mindful of the effect of those kinds of critiques on the program. So either they're doing it out of ignorance about the difference between what foreign intelligence and the tradecraft and the way that you manage sources and the covert clandestine nature of foreign intelligence, and overt, open, declared diplomatic reporting. So I think that folks who say that the GSRP is sort of foreign intel on the cheap without the right framework are actually doing a massive disservice to Canada and are putting and are at risk of putting our folks in harm's way. And I think that that's irresponsible. Do I think the GSRP needs to evolve and change? Absolutely, 100%. It always does. All programs do. You cannot have programs stagnate, or programs that just because they were fit for purpose in a particular era, that they don't need to adapt and change. I stopped working with the GSRP almost a decade ago, right? And I moved on to become Canada's ambassador to Norway in 2014, and I served as the Director General for Security in what is today Global Affairs between 2010 and 2014, where the program reported to me. Things have changed. We need to make sure that we continually ask questions about whether or not the tools that we have respond to the needs that we have today. Does it reflect a changing risk environment? Does it reflect the move away from counterterrorism as one of the key themes to to global geopolitics and big power competition? How do we make sure that the information that Canadians and our partners need is actually acquired through the broad range of tools that we have at our disposal, including diplomacy, but also other means, whether or not it's intelligence. I used to be the Director General of Intelligence Operations at CSIS, our Signals Intelligence Agency. So I understand the nuance between the two. And I just wish that there was a greater cooperation and a greater communication between the collectors of intelligence, particularly security intelligence, as is done by my friends at CSIS, and our foreign ministry, so that we do not again, muddy these waters in a way that plays into the hands of hostile state actors like China and Russia.
Thanks for your analysis, Artur, and great to have you on. Next, we'll turn to CG fellow Wesley Wark, who also advised the Prime Minister on National Security Council from 2005 to 2009, Canada Border Service Agency from 2006 to 2010, and also offered guidance on national security to the Minister of Public Safety. Wesley, so nice of you to join us again. Thanks for making some time to speak with us today. There's been a lot of discussion in the news as of late in light of claims from Mr. Spavor around the GSRP, so I'm eager to hear your views on some of the perspectives being offered. For starters, what is the nature of the allegations made by Mr. Spavor against the GSRP, and how does he link it to his imprisonment by Chinese authorities? And furthermore, what are the implications of this, if any, for Canadian security?
I guess I begin by saying that we're aware through media reporting that Mr. Spavor has launched some kind of legal action with the government of Canada. And again, just according to that media reporting, we don't have any other access to the nature of this legal action. According to the media reporting, Mr. Spavor has claimed that his imprisonment by the Chinese authorities and charges that were made against him for espionage were all based on the fact that he provided information to Mr. Kovrig when Mr. Kovrig was serving as a Global Security Reporting Program Officer for Global Affairs in China. And because he supplied that information, he claims that the Chinese then fastened on that as evidence of his espionage activities. And so basically he's blaming Mr. Kovrig and the Canadian government for his imprisonment, as opposed to blaming the Chinese authorities for his imprisonment. It is a bizarre turn, I think it has to be said, in the affair of the two Michaels. And it certainly seems to undercut the Canadian government's position, alongside many of its allies, that China was simply acting in terms of hostage diplomacy during that affair. And so it's given some ammunition to the to Chinese officials to say, well, look, we've proven right all along there was real espionage going on in this case. It's a very unfortunate surfacing, I think, of these allegations. It plays into the hands of the Chinese authorities, and I think it, from my perspective, muddies the waters a little bit in terms of understanding what the Global Security Reporting Program actually is. and how it functions. And some voices in the media have tried to correct that impression, but who knows, how effective that has been. There have been ongoing allegations in the media, as you know, most recently raised by Dick Fadden, former CSIS director and former National Security Intelligence advisor, principally to the Harper government, that suggests in pretty kind of mild language that there might have been some occasions where GSRP officers kind of transgressed their mission. But those kinds of allegations are pretty vague, it has to be said, and that's part of the whole problem here of really, I think, for Canadians trying to understand what the GSRP is and what distinguishes it from intelligence collection of the kind that various foreign agencies engage in, and to a certain extent, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service engages in.
How would you say the GSRP has evolved over the years? How can it continue meeting Canada's changing needs? And within that, what considerations do you think should guide future adaptations, especially considering the evolving global threats we're facing?
Yeah, these are good questions. And I think certainly one thing that can be said is that if the initial impetus for part of the creation of the GSRP was really to provide more information about global terrorism threats developing in different parts of the world post 9/11, I think our sense of national security threats has expanded vastly beyond a concern focused exclusively on terrorism. And it would reach into areas like climate change security impacts of pandemics, regime instability in various parts of the world, authoritarian practices, disinformation, cyber capabilities. I mean, there's just a wide range of global security problems that the GSRP could usefully collect information on. So I guess the first thing to be said is that the scope of their reporting, it has expanded well beyond a concern with terrorism. The second thing is that over the years, the kind of geographic, we don't have a precise kind of sense of this, but clearly the geographic deployment of officers in this program has been expanded. And so it may not have been in the beginning truly a global security reporting program, but we've now seen a map of the current deployments, and it clearly is that. There are GSRP officers in every continent and region of the world. And that, it seems to me, is to the good, and also reflects the fact that its scope is expanded well beyond terrorism. The other interesting thing that has emerged from the recent publication, again by the Globe and Mail, of the map of GSRP officer deployments, is that there are countries in the world where the decision has been taken that Canada should not deploy GSRP officers directly. And in intelligence lingo, this is often referred to as denied areas. There are countries or regions that it is simply too difficult, too dangerous to operate in because of their authoritarian practices, laws, their surveillance, domestic surveillance practices and capabilities, their hostility to the West. And what really stands out, I mean, there's some obvious suspects that fall into that category where GSRP officers are deliberately not posted. And that includes countries like Iran and North Korea. But interestingly, it includes Russia as well, which seems to me a kind of very understandable decision. And when you think about those countries, it's not that the GSRP program has decided not to try and provide reporting about those countries, but rather they do it from what are called periphery countries. That is, countries in the region where there might be an officer appointed who can keep a watch on whatever information can be collected on, broad security issues in that denied area. So, for example, with regard to Russia, we know currently that there are no GSRP officers stationed in Russia, but there are GSRP officers stationed on the periphery, geographic periphery, who clearly have a mandate to provide some reporting on Russia. And that includes GSRP officers in Latvia, in the Baltic, and GSRP officers in Kyiv, in Ukraine. And there is also an expansion plan, which may be temporarily sidelined because of budget cutting, which would have provided more coverage from the periphery on Russia. Now, I mentioned this in particular. The Russia case seems an obvious one to me. And you really wouldn't want a GSRP officer trying to function in Russia. It would be impossible and dangerous. But interestingly, we still have a GSRP officer posted to Beijing. And I just wonder how in the present circumstances, and not least in regard to the experience that Canada went through with the two Michaels, whether it makes a lot of sense to have a GSRP officer in China, notwithstanding great interest in trying to better understand China's approach to global security issues, whether it wouldn't be better to try and cover China as Russia is covered from periphery countries. So that may be an ongoing debate. We don't really know within global affairs, but it does kind of highlight the problems that emerged with Michael Kovrig, for example, trying to function as a GSRP officer in China, and the Chinese government using that official diplomatic post, which was declared to them at the time, using it as an excuse to level espionage charges against him, which were actually never tried in court before he was released.
Thanks, Wesley. Before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts, or is there anything you think is important to discuss which we haven't already?
I think there are two things that I'll just say quickly in addition to material we've covered. One is, as we've seen from some of the commentary in the media, the whole question of the GSRP and its nature and its possible vulnerabilities and frailties has, interestingly, for me at least, given a bit of renewed attention to a long-standing debate in Canada about whether this country really needs its own independent foreign intelligence service. We don't have such a thing, that is a foreign intelligence service focused on what's called human or human source collection. We don't have such a thing. CSIS has a very limited mandate, and the GSRP doesn't do intelligence collection in that sense. So we've been having this debate in Canada since the end of the Second World War, but it is a perennial issue, and it's come to the surface again. And some people have suggested that the experience of the GSRP suggests, whether negatively or positively, Canada really should be thinking about this seriously again. And the other issue, and you raised it in a question that I didn't quite answer, is, well, given that there may be sensitivities around the operations of the GSRP, what can be done to ensure that it is, truly accountable and there are proper checks and controls to just ensure that GSRP officers don't step over some, difficult to establish line, perhaps, between the kind of information collection they do and the kind of covert intelligence gathering that's done by an intelligence agency. And that seems to me a very good point. And what I would say about it is that Global Affairs Canada, I think, has a problem when it comes to dealing with its intelligence and information gathering function. And that problem was really highlighted in a recent report from the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, a special report on Global Affairs Canada's intelligence activities. And what that report really called attention to was the fact that all of the activities that Global Affairs conducts in terms of information gathering and intelligence assessments and so on is kind of isolated within the department, and that not enough attention is paid to it by senior leadership in the department, including the deputy minister and including especially the minister. So it is an important activity, but there isn't sufficient, if you like, ministerial accountability for it. This was really, I think, a strong criticism that the NCCOP report made. And I would say that the very first step in ensuring that the global security reporting program is properly made accountable is just to ensure that internal accountability is working. And without that internal accountability, you can't really have a functioning external accountability mechanism, whatever we might imagine. I would say, just in defense of the idea that there are some existing controls around the global security reporting program that we know from that NCCOP report, a couple of important things. One is that there is an interdepartmental coordination committee that discusses GSRP activities, across the security intelligence community and the federal government. So that coordination committee is designed. Who knows how well it works? We just don't know. But it's designed to make sure that problems don't emerge in the conduct of GSRP officers. And the second thing, and in a way even more interesting to me, is that in 2012, I believe it was, the department put together a kind of guidance manual, a rule book for GSRP officers, just to kind of clarify their duties, responsibilities, things that they are allowed to do, things that they're not allowed to do. We've never seen that rule book in public, of course, but its existence suggests to me that the department was taking seriously the idea of really trying to define the work of GSRP officials. So there are some internal checks and balances. I think there could be more. I think ministerial accountability is very important in this regard, and kind of better integration of intelligence activities in GAC with a broader mandate of the department would be important. Lots of changes could be made in that regard. But what I take away from the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians report is basically this: that the GSRP is not a kind of Wild West cowboy outfit. There are controls, and we'll have to wait. And this, I'm sorry, I've gone on at length about this, Josh, but we'll have to wait to see the first really in-depth review of the GSRP made public. This was a review conducted not by NCCOP, but by the National Security Intelligence Review Agency, its counterpart. And it was conducted some time ago now. It's never been released. It wasn't released or redacted and published by NCIRA during the time of the imprisonment of the two Michaels, perhaps for obvious reasons. And now, unfortunately, although NCIRA says it would like to work on redacting it and releasing it, unfortunately, it's tied up in an access to information request. And as you'll know, Josh, is an entirely different subject for discussion, but ATIP requests take an enormous amount of time to be resolved.
Thanks again, Wesley. Take care and hope to have you on again soon. To close out the program, we'll speak with Dr. Philippe Lagassé, Associate Professor and the Barton Chair at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. Dr. Lagassé, good to have you on the program again. We have quite a bit to cover in maybe 10 or so minutes here: accountability and oversight, the statutory footing debate, and the possibility of a foreign intelligence service. So let's dive right in. What accountability and oversight mechanisms exist within GSRP?
So within GSRP, we have the standard accountability mechanisms that you would have with any aspect of government. So within governments or within the department itself, you have vertical accountability up through to the minister. So that is something you always have to take into account. At the end of the day, the activities of these agencies and units within any department, there's a chain of accountability that goes up to the minister, and the minister is ultimately accountable and answerable before Parliament. And also the minister is accountable to the Prime Minister and committees of cabinet for their activities. Perhaps more importantly, though, in this context, now that we have the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, so NSICOP has the ability to review the activities of Global Affairs Canada when it comes to intelligence, security intelligence, and they have done so already. They have a report that came out about it. Similarly, the National Security Intelligence Review Agency has that authority. So they are able to look into the intelligence activities of Global Affairs Canada as well. Now, they have also produced a report, but it has a public version of that has not yet been released. So even though NSICOP and NCIRA don't have a specific obligation to review the security intelligence activities of Global Affairs Canada, they have done so. So there's already mechanisms in place for that. And finally, we can say, you can look at parliamentary committees would be in a position to look at their activities too.
Should GSRP, in your opinion, be placed on a statutory footing? And if that were the case, would it make a difference at all?
I think in making the case for a statutory footing, it would be important to know why we're doing it. What is it that we're hoping to achieve? If we just want to keep it as is, it's a difficult case to make. What is it about putting it on a statutory footing that would be different? So if you're not introducing a warrants regime or authorizations or something like that, given that it's not a covert activity, then and it doesn't violate the Canadian laws or other things of that nature, it would be hard to see what it is that the warrants regime is trying to do, or what putting it on a statutory footing would be different than now. If it's a question of delineating its authorities more specifically, I think there's also a risk there of ossifying it. A number of the recommendations that have been made about either making it more of a diplomatic reporting body or moving it out of the intelligence branch at Global Affairs, all these things are better done under prerogative authority, where there's far more flexibility and you can adjust as needed. If you were to go on a statutory footing for something like this, the risk you have is that the parliamentary cycling hand is just so slow that when it comes to making changes to it, tinkering with it, improving it, you have to wait for a fairly long legislative cycle. And certainly as compared to a country like Australia, where they legislate national security often and rapidly. We just don't do that. So I would caution against a statutory framework unless there's a strong reason for it. And one of those reasons might be to turn it into something more like a foreign intelligence service. But we can discuss that in a bit, I suspect.
On that, what does GSRP tell us about the government's authority to set up a foreign intelligence service under the royal prerogative?
So I think the GSRP is a good indication that if there were a pressing need or a real desire on the part of the government of Canada to set up some kind of embryonic foreign intelligence service, it could do so under the royal prerogative. You would likely want to put that on a statutory footing relatively quickly, given all the controversy that would surround it. But it indicates to us that there is an underlying authority to establish a foreign intelligence service without necessarily legislating for it at the outset. And that might, if we're particularly concerned about wanting to have better foreign intelligence quickly and to then kind of work out the finer points of it after, we do have the ability to start setting that up under the Crown prerogative and housed within Foreign Affairs. And it's important to note, if we need evidence of this, just look at MI6 in the United Kingdom, which began as that, and similarly for ASIS in Australia. I think the debate really comes down to what is the nature of diplomatic reporting, and I think the crux of the debate is the issue that we want to constrain their activities and ensure that they only engage in certain types of diplomatic reporting, right, and that they stay within certain bounds. That seems to be what the concern has been raised. Others will argue, and I think understandably so, that either you delineate that more clearly or you just shut it down because it's creating too many difficulties. And then there is this debate about, well, if you really need this and you need it to be robust and you need it to have additional powers and you want to make full use of this and you want to get serious about it, then you should set up a foreign intelligence service. So to my mind, it really does come down to a debate that we need to have first, namely, what do we want this GSRP to be doing? And if we want it to either do more or less or to operate differently, that should be the starting point of the debate. And then we can have a discussion of what kind of legal framework should be around it and where do we go from there based on the option that we choose. Because it may be that there's no need to start legislating this, particularly if all we want to do is keep it tighter in terms of what it does.
Thanks again, Dr. Lagassé. Appreciate your analysis as always, and I'm looking forward to reading your latest book, which you edited with Mr. Jeannot, Canadian Defense Policy in Theory and Practice, Volume 2. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.